Welcome back, everyone, to the Hack Summit. We're joined here by Dries Buytaert, who is the founder and lead developer of the Drupal content management system. Dries received a PhD in computer science in 2008 from Ghent University in Belgium. He also founded Acquia, which is a support organization for Drupal, which also launched whitehouse.gov using Drupal. In 2008, he was named among the young entrepreneurs of tech by Business Week and a top 35 innovator in tech, under 35 by MIT. And he's a personal friend of mine. Dries, we really, really appreciate you being here today. Thanks for making the time.
You're welcome. It's very excited to be here.
Great. So, Dries, I'd love to just start out by just helping our audience get up to speed on you and your background a little bit. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of how you grew up, how you got into programming, and your early career. That would be great to just get that context.
Sure. So I grew up in Belgium. I'm 37 now, so it's been a while, but I was born and raised in Belgium. I got into computers because one day my dad came home. I think I was about 10 years old, maybe a little bit younger, and he brought home like 3 little books, programming for kids, and it basically involved typing over code from the book into the Commodore 64 that we had at home, and by typing over the code, you ended up with little games, on the computer, and so that got me into computers. And then eventually, when I was 15, my dad asked me, he's an oncologist, he asked me to build a software program to help him manage his his patient database, basically. And so I spent one of my summer vacations working on that. And then from there, I ended up going to college in Antwerp, and I studied computer science at the University of Antwerp. It's where I started Drupal as well. And then I guess my first job out of college was to be an embedded software engineer for a small startup in Belgium. It's where I got the startup bug. But I was working on a team where we worked on embedded Linux, and specifically I was working on a Java virtual machine written for that embedded device, and I ended up writing a just-in-time compiler, worked on the garbage collector, things like that. And then from there I went back to college to do a PhD. My PhD was also about Java, runtime performance of Java, profiling of Java applications, garbage collection, these kinds of things. So nothing to do with the web, nothing to do with Drupal. But that's kind of the short version of some of my my early career.
That's great. And so how did you go from that early career to go about inventing Drupal? What's the story there?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, Drupal was kind of invented by accident. So this was 2000. So I was still at university in Antwerp, and I was somewhat involved with the Linux kernel, and specifically with the wireless network drivers. And at some point, we had a wireless network going in my dorm room, and I said that it would have, it would be handy if we had a small message board so that everybody on the network could leave each other notes. And so I had been building websites before, but PHP and MySQL were sort of new technologies. And so I decided to spend a couple of evenings or a couple of days building a quick message board in PHP and MySQL because I wanted to learn these new technologies. And so 2 days or 2 evenings turned into 15 years. But Drupal Drupal was born as a message board, quickly evolved into an experimental platform for me. So at the time, the web was still, much, much smaller than it is today. And I felt like you could kind of wrap your arms around everything that was happening. And so RSS was being defined, and I was on the mailing list where RSS was being defined. And I didn't contribute in creating RSS at all, but I was lurking, and I said, I can implement this. And so I would implement RSS feeds in my message board. And another example was people started to use the web to keep diaries, public diaries it was called, and that obviously became blogging, but this was before blogging was called blogging. And so I was like, oh, I can add a blogging feature to my message board. And so I started adding all of these things, and that forced me to rewrite my message board several times over. And at some point, that message board was an experimental platform, and I decided to share it with the world, so to speak, in 2001. So after about a year or something, and released it as Drupal.
Wow. And why did you decide to open source it? What went into that thought process?
Yeah, to be honest, not a lot. But as I mentioned, I was running my website for my dorm, and so it was an intranet kind of website. It wasn't publicly accessible. But when I finished my my master's, I moved out of the dorm, and so because we had this small little community going, intranet style, I decided that I wanted to keep it alive. And so I moved my intranet message board experimental platform to the public web. So we could all stay in touch as friends after we all moved out, and we did. And so at that point, my little site became public. It started to attract an audience interested in the future of the web, because I was experimenting with those things and I was writing or blogging about them. And people started to give suggestions, like, at the time the site was drop.org was a domain name. I still have that domain name. And so it worked actually like Dig worked later. And so people could submit stories, people could vote on stories, and then the best stories would automatically go to the new main page, for example. And so people would say, oh, how about you tweak the algorithm, or how about this, or hey, have you seen this new trend on the web? Maybe you should implement that too. And so after a while, I'm like, you know what? Instead of me doing all the work, how about I make this, the software behind my website available as open source for you, so you can use it as your own experimental platform. And I spent, I don't think I spent more than 30 seconds thinking of a name. And I literally copied my GPL license file from my kernel tree, because I was using Linux, I was contributing to Linux. Copied the GPL license file from the Linux kernel tree into my website, created a tarball or zip file, I guess, and uploaded that to my website. I expected maybe 10 people to download this thing and to use it. So I didn't pay a lot of attention to the name or the license. It was just, kind of just happened, I guess. And obviously then ended up changing my life. But yeah, that's how it was released as open source.
Wow. And so from those humble beginnings,
Mm-hmm.
how has it grown today? What are some stats today on Drupal?
Yeah, I mean, today Drupal is one of the largest open source communities in one install base. I mean, it's used by almost 3% of the web, 3% of all the websites, and specifically big websites. But it's also one of the largest open source communities in terms of active contributors. So we have about 30,000, 35,000 people that are actively contributing to Drupal. So I don't think there's many, open source projects that have that kind of involvement. So we power many, many websites, typically, more complex, larger websites. Weather.com is an example. It's in the top 20 websites in the world. It's powered by Drupal. You mentioned whitehouse.gov being a Drupal site. A lot of media sites from, the Grammys, I think last weekend or 2 weekends ago, to the Emmys, to almost all of the artist websites, from Justin Bieber to Bruno Mars to Rolling Stones. They're all using Drupal. Lots of government. The Australian government is re-platforming everything on Drupal, so there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of websites. Johnson & Johnson, 8,000 websites on Drupal. Pfizer, over 1,000 websites on Drupal. I mean, I can go on and on. Pretty much every university, MIT, Stanford, Harvard, have hundreds, some of them thousands of Drupal sites. So it's a global project with with a lot of users.
That's incredible. I mean, with that number of did you say 30,000 contributors?
Yeah,
That's
30,000.
mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's large. Yeah.
So I'm curious about how you organize that. So open source governance is kind of a hot topic these days. So how does that work with Drupal? Are you kind of spearheading the project? Like what's your role, and how have you created a governance model that works for the project?
Yeah, I mean it's a complex governance model. I'm still we call it the project lead in open source. I'm still running the project. The way the project is structured is there's Drupal core, which is the base platform, if you will, and that's kind of what I'm overseeing from a product and a technical point of view. But then there's about 30,000 modules, we call them plugins, extensions, and these are maintained by their teams. Some modules are maintained by one person, others have teams of 20, 30 people behind them. But so I spent most of my focus on Drupal core. And Drupal core, there is a core committers team. It's a team of 7-ish people that can actually make changes to core. They're organized. Some of them focus more on release management. Others are more product management. And these people, in turn, are surrounded by what we call subsystem maintainers. So there's people that are responsible for pieces of Drupal, like somebody could be responsible for our web services APIs, or somebody else could be responsible for like the taxonomy module in Drupal to classify content and things like that. So they have different levels of responsibility and leadership in the project. And then there's just a whole lot of volunteers. We just released Drupal 8 as an example, and we accepted patches or changes from over 3,300 different people. So that's a total number of people that contributed to Drupal 8 core. And so that team, of that leadership team around Drupal, of these 7-ish people, and then 20, 30 subsystem maintainers, they try to guide the larger community. Other than that, we use a lot of engineering best practices, to be honest. We have a culture of peer review. We do a lot of automated testing. All the things you would expect in a traditional software environment, or a traditional proprietary software company.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like from what I've seen, you've been able to very successfully monetize Drupal through a company you created called Acquia. So can you tell us a little bit more about Acquia, and also how you've been successful with Acquia, and what maybe some inspiring open source developers can learn from that example, who may be thinking about monetizing their open source projects?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I started Drupal when I was still in college, and then I went to work as the embedded software engineer, and went back to college for my PhD. And so at the end of my PhD, I decided to turn my passion into my full-time job, and that's when I started Acquia. So Acquia is 8 years old. We're in business for like 7 years, I would say, like that we had a product to sell. And so Drupal predated Acquia. And so, Acquia is actually one of the fastest growing private technology companies in the United States. And so in those 7, 8 years, we've grown to over 850 people globally. And what we do is we provide different products for around Drupal. Like our main product is something called Acquia Cloud, which is a platform as a service environment. I think you guys just talked to Heroku, is that right? So
That's right.
It's comparable to Heroku, where we have developer tools to do automated testing, where we have load testing tools, and then obviously production tools, so we can dynamically scale sites, stuff like that. So that's one piece of what we do. We provide commercial grade support as well, which is sort of the traditional open source business model that Red Hat and MySQL and JBoss and the likes pioneered. And then we also have a couple of different software as a service tools that we built as well. And so one example is a product called Acquia Lift. and it's a personalization tool. So it's used by organizations that want to personalize content to individual users. So imagine you're a newspaper website. Lyft can learn what you're interested in based on your clickstream behavior. Like if you read a lot about politics and you don't read anything about sports, the system will learn that, and next time you come to the site, even if you're an anonymous user, we will serve up more content that you like and less content that you're not interested in. And so that's obviously very impactful in terms of getting people to come back, but also in case of an e-commerce website, will help drive transfer conversions as well. So Acquia sells all of these things from cloud to SaaS tools around Drupal, personalization being one of them, and that's how we go to market.
Great. And so what can the open source developers in our audience learn who are aspiring for getting their projects highly adopted? Because obviously, Drupal has an incredible amount of traction, and I'm sure there's many incredible open source projects out there in a variety of categories that maybe aren't getting the attention that they really deserve from a technical perspective. So how have you been able to get adoption for Drupal, and how can other open source developers learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no quick and easy answer, to be honest. It took 15 years, which is a long time. So I guess my first piece of advice would be patient. There's no quick win here. But I think Drupal's been successful for a couple of reasons. But the first one I would say is a team. And I'm a big believer of building strong teams and attracting great people, and that's been the success behind Drupal as well as Acquia. So I've seen it work over and over again, and so I'm fortunate that I get to work with a lot of great people, and it's the success and it's the hard work of all of these people that has made Drupal what it is today. And I think that's probably the number one thing that I would focus on. Other things I would say, that are maybe more typical to open source, is it's around getting people to volunteer, because most people work on Drupal not because they get paid or because they have to, but because they enjoy to contribute to Drupal. And I think that's all about giving people a sense of ownership and listening to people and making sure they feel heard. And so I think we've created a great culture, a culture that invites participation. And I try to, for example, set a direction, but it's kind of a high level direction, and then it's up to other people in the community to help make that vision a reality, but also to provide a lot of input into that vision and to bring things to the table that I've actually never thought about myself as well. And so I think that's really important, because it makes people feel like they're really can own part of the project, and I think that kind of ownership is what makes people contribute.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that there's some trust issues that go along with giving ownership there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that takes time. And I think for us, one of the other important things was actually, meeting with each other. And in our case, it's face-to-face, but also virtual. But early on in the life of Drupal, we started doing conferences and Drupal camps and meetups, and now we have hundreds of these events each year all around the world where people meet face-to-face. And I think it's incredibly important for open source projects, because it's really easy to be a pain in the ass, or to misbehave online when you've never actually met somebody before, right? But once you've met somebody, once you've seen somebody in person, once you've had a beer or some food with somebody, it changes the relationship. It creates a sense of camaraderie that's maybe hard to create in an online world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it can be done, but it's a little bit more difficult. But having these face-to-face interactions has been really important and creates these trust relationships. And not just trust, but it also helps you understand the other person. Helps you see that person's perspective. And so it changes the way you collaborate. It changes the way you work together. And it creates that, to go back to the first point, that stronger team.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, let's pause for a second here on my questions. Let's take it to the audience. and hear some of the questions that they have for you. So the first question with the highest number of votes, 209 votes actually, is if you started Drupal today, would you still write it in PHP, and why?
That's a great question.
It's a tough one. Yeah, it's a tough one.
So first of all, I will say that I actually think Drupal has been so successful because it is written in PHP, right? If it were written in Java or something, it would never have become what it is today. And I can say that because of a Java background. I did my PhD in Java, so I know Java well. But the fact that PHP was so accessible, the fact that people can download it, install it, and immediately start changing it, the fact that people could run it on shared hosting for $10 a month versus in the Java world at the time, you had to have your own dedicated machine, right? And so the accessibility of PHP has been critical to Drupal's success. I would still probably write it in a scripting language, because I think a scripting language like PHP or JavaScript or Ruby or has those characteristics of being accessible and quick for people to to get involved in, as well as affordable. I actually may do it again in PHP, to be honest. I don't feel I feel like there's maybe two kinds of engineers: the kinds that are like, they love a particular language and they're very like religious almost about their language, and then I think there's engineers that work with any language, or that are less picky about their language. And I think I fit in the latter category, where I think you can build great things with PHP. And I think there's a lot of things to like about PHP. Is it the best language in the world? Is it the prettiest language in the world? No. But it is one of the largest or most adopted languages, if not the most adopted language on the web. And that has some benefits too.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why Node.js has been so successful, is the prevalence of JavaScript on the front end.
Right.
And all the developers politically that are already kind of aligned with JavaScript who can now become semi-capable backend developers. So, a lot of folks were kind of wondering, would Node succeed? And obviously it has done well for that reason. And I think PHP has a lot of those same characteristics.
Well, exactly. And, people should remember that JavaScript was invented, pretty much 20 years ago. And that for the first 10, 12 years of its life, no serious developer would use JavaScript. Like, it was slow, didn't work consistently across browsers. And so JavaScript for the longest time was kind of poo-pooed, And I think a lot has changed in more recent years with, Chrome coming, being launched, and V8, the JavaScript engine and the just-in-time compiler made things much faster. And then companies like Twitter and Airbnb sort of, and Google with Gmail and Google Maps embracing JavaScript in a big way, has sort of spiked the interest, if you will, of professional developers to start using JavaScript. And now, of course, with all the client-side frameworks, Angular, Ember, React, all of these tools, of course, JavaScript is sort of in a renaissance almost, and is liked by professional developers. So languages go through phases. I think PHP, there's a lot of great things going for it recently. Like the new PHP engine is much faster. Object-oriented PHP is starting to get much better. So, languages live, and I think it's all about keeping them relevant and making them better and better.
Yeah, and you look at Facebook, for example, as a pretty good case study there for building a very large and successful business off of, it was PHP, right? That they built that off of, is that right?
Yeah, it's mostly PHP, and so it's really less about the language and more about the architecture in my mind. And Facebook is interesting because it's probably one of the largest websites in the world, if not the largest. But what makes it even more impressive is that they have like 1 billion people visiting every day. So most people visiting multiple times a day. And no two pages that they serve are identical, right? Because hopefully your Facebook page looks different from my Facebook page, and they've been able to build that because they came up with a new fundamental architecture, what they call Big Pipe. So they completely reimagined how to build pages and how to deliver pages. And that's kind of like an architectural change that could have been implemented in any language, really. But the fact that they did it in PHP, obviously is great, but they didn't have to. I think that to me is more exciting. What's exciting is not the language, but it's like, how do you build things with a language? How do you rethink traditional architectures, and how do you actually use different tools? Like for us to build these large websites in Drupal, it's not just about PHP. We use it with Varnish and Memcache and all of these things. Putting all of these things in your toolbox and then combining them in ways, that allow you to build these big websites is what actually, is what is exciting.
Great. All right. So the next question is kind of funny. For some reason, 155 votes for this question.
Okay.
How many hours a day do you sleep as a programmer? That is what our audience wants to know, Dries, today.
Yeah.
Inquiring minds want to know how many hours do you sleep?
So I have to be honest, I haven't done much programming lately. So my role has changed so much that I'm doing a lot of different things, from evangelizing Drupal to more sort of on the product management side, setting the vision, to making sure we have the right people on the team, to helping to run the Drupal Association, to putting on conferences like you're doing today, to helping to run Acquia as well. And so between all of these things, there's not a lot of time for programming. I still look at code. I'm still reviewing patches and committing patches. But between all of these things, I work probably way too much. I've always worked 12-hour days minimum.
Do you miss the days when you had more time to program?
I do.
You know how like a lot of programmers, they get promoted over time to become more and more of a manager. And some programmers embrace that. They love being a manager. They love the business side of things. And some programmers hate that. They just want to be a programmer, So how do you feel about it?
Yeah, first of all, I love the business side as well. I love the variety, from helping with marketing to sales to business strategy, to fundraising. I love all of these things. Having said that, I do miss programming. Like every day, I'm like, oh, I wish I could just program for the day. And so, yeah, in my dreams, eventually, maybe I'll go back to programming, or somehow I find time to do a little bit more programming. Even when I was, working as an embedded software engineer, I would go home at night and program, right? Because I had a full-time job, or during my PhD, I would do my PhD during the day and do Drupal at night and in the weekends. And even when I was doing that, I had another pet project. And so I was always working on way too many things, and that hasn't changed. And so work too many hours a day. Unfortunately, it's not going to programming. But I miss programming, but at the same time, I'm okay with that, because I feel like for me to program, that wouldn't be optimizing my impact. At this stage, or at this role that I'm in right now. The best way to use my time is to enable others to be good at programming, and to remove blockers that people have, and that's how we can optimize Drupal's impact, is for me to be an enabler for others.
Great, awesome answer. All right, so let me go back to my questions for a second, and we'll come back to the audience in a few minutes. The audience has a very important question, which must be answered, which we will address later in this broadcast.
All right, I haven't seen their questions yet.
Yeah. So, oh, they've got a really good one.
Tension is building up.
They've got a really good one. It's the #1 voted question right now. So we'll come back to that in a second.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about Drupal and how it compares to the rest of the ecosystem. So, kind of the elephant in the room here is WordPress, right? Mm-hmm. So WordPress, built by Automatic and Matt Mullenweg, obviously a lot of traction on websites as well. So maybe you could shed some light on where you think Drupal and WordPress compare, And when do you think would be appropriate to use Drupal versus WordPress for a website? What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And I know Matt well, and we're friends. We try to meet up whenever we can and exchange notes on our communities. But I actually think that Drupal and WordPress, while they're both open source, both written in PHP, they're also very different in many ways. Drupal typically is used more by larger organizations doing more complex things, versus WordPress is more accessible, more easy to use, but in my opinion is also less suitable for building more complex websites, and which is why we don't like, as Acquia, we don't actually compete much with WordPress. Like when in our business, and we focus on the Fortune 2000, we focus on large companies. We tend to compete with proprietary competitors like Adobe and Sitecore and the likes, and not with WordPress, because WordPress tends to be used more on the low end of the market. And where Drupal and WordPress compete is there. And there's a lot of people building smaller sites with Drupal too, but some of the differences, I guess, are around architecture, and I believe Drupal has a more flexible, more extensible architecture that's solving harder problems in core in the base platform. Like, for example, our entity API is much more extensive and robust than WordPress content modeling. And so for organizations that have a lot of content types or very complex relationships with the different content types, Drupal is going to be more powerful for them or easier to use. We also have things like views, which allows you to sort of almost build it's like a query language almost to help you build pages or tables or listings of content. That's very powerful in Drupal as well. So I think these are the things where Drupal shines, as well as complex integrations. So integrations with maybe enterprise commerce systems, these kinds of things. So I don't know if that answered the question, but
yeah, no, that's a great answer. So I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of curious about some interesting stories that have happened to you
Mm-hmm.
as you've kind of taken the mantle for Drupal over so many years. Is there kind of any crazy story that you've seen happen in your career that you might want to share with our audience?
Gosh, I have to think about that actually, because I feel there's so many stories. I can go back to sort of the beginning of Drupal, or in the early days. I still remember. I'm trying to think which story to tell, but one story would be Howard Dean.
Okay.
So this is actually, I think, quite interesting. So Howard Dean was a presidential candidate in the United States in 2004. And he was kind of an underdog. Like, he wasn't a front runner, as you may remember. But he was also the first presidential candidate to really use the web to help him campaign. And so he built a platform called Dean Space. And it enabled local groups, towns or cities, to help campaign and raise money. And so he built that platform on Drupal. And so he took Drupal and added some modules to do fundraising and these kinds of things. And it was actually quite interesting in that these different sites that people could set up with Dean Space or Drupal could also talk to each other. So somebody could write something and others could take that article or blog post into their site. So they created this network. And so Howard Dean ended up going quite far for being an underdog. And a couple of books have been written. Obviously, didn't win the election. Bush won. But books have been written about how we used the web for campaigning. And obviously in the next election, every presidential candidate was using the web for campaigning, and almost all of them used Drupal as the basis of their platform. And so to me, this was quite remarkable, especially at the time. It was hard to believe. And then something cool happened. And so, because people took note about this campaign platform, and so the people behind DeanSpace, or some of them, they decided to take this platform and to turn into something better, because they kind of cobbled it together quickly with the minimal resources that they had. And so they raised a little bit of money, and they started a company called Civic Space. And they said, we're going to spend the next 4 years making this platform better, so that by the next presidential elections, we're going to be ready and our tool is going to be all shiny and work really, really well. And so they did. However, and this is where it gets interesting, they didn't want to wait 4 years to test their campaign software. And so they said, what else can we campaign for? And so at the time, Mozilla had just released Firefox. And so they said, you know what, we're going to campaign for Firefox. And so they built a website called Spread Firefox, using Drupal and their campaign extensions. And really, Spread Firefox is what made Firefox, so widely used. And so they did all of these amazing campaigns. I remember one, which was one day they decided to raise $50,000. And they're going to use that money to take out a full-page ad in the New York Times bashing Internet Explorer. And so they raised $50,000, and they took out that ad on the weekend edition. I think it was 1 or 2 pages, and it was huge advertising for Firefox. And so they did so many cool things, and they really helped put Firefox on the map. And so just one story of how Drupal was very influential in a presidential election, even though that candidate didn't win, but it set the stage for campaigning. And the people that came out of that, by the way, ended up running campaigns for Obama and all. And so to then Drupal helping Firefox becoming, widely adopted. And the people coming out of that, like Chris Messina, Chris Messina was at the very first DrupalCon in Antwerp talking about these things and planning for these things. And he ended up inventing the hashtag, for example. And so there's a lot of kind of great things that happened along the way. These are just a couple of examples, obviously, but the history of Drupal is sort of this, chain of remarkable events, in my opinion. And still to date, I think great things seem to happen left and right. So.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to ask you one more question from my list, and we'll go back to the audience.
Yep.
So I guess the biggest thing I'm wondering here is, let's see, what is the most interesting question here? So I guess a lot of our audience members are not yet at, in terms of the level of accomplishment, they haven't yet become a CTO or a VP of engineering. Many of our audience members are developers, and they're hoping one day maybe to kind of become more of an architect or more of a CTO. And so, do you have any advice for aspiring developers out there for how they can be successful in their careers?
Yeah, I do, and they may not like it, which is learn sales and marketing.
Oh, wow.
And I say that a lot because if I think about what I do, it's pretty much sales and marketing. As a CTO or sort of I guess there's different kinds of CTOs, but or as an entrepreneur, you really are selling all the time. And I use sales in the broad sense, in a very broad sense, because obviously when you're hiring people, which senior technical leaders do, you're selling. You're not just interviewing, but you're also selling the company to the potential candidate. Once you've hired somebody and you're running a small team, whether it's as an architect or a CTO or anything else, you also have to direct those people, and that's also a form of selling. When you're raising money, if you're starting a company, you're selling. When you're involved in customer-facing activities, which I think any senior technical leader ends up doing, you're also selling. And so I think a lot of what, you can be a great engineer, But if you're not sort of selling again in the broad sense, I think you may struggle. And so I feel like while I'm an engineer, I feel like 80% of what I do is sales and marketing. So
and a lot of that may not come natural to programmers. Many programmers, including myself, grew up introverted. Where we're kind of selling, interacting with others didn't come natural. A lot of programmers are more comfortable being in front of a computer than selling. So how can a programmer overcome those psychological barriers?
Yeah, I'm like you. I'm an introvert, and I think I've overcome it by doing. Like over the last 15 years, I've sort of started doing more of it, and over time it becomes more and more natural. And by no means am I the best at this, but I don't think you actually have to be the best, in selling. So yeah, just start doing and have faith that you can actually learn these things. I do think it's a skill you can acquire.
Great, thanks, Dries. Okay, so let's go back to the audience. So let's see, I'm just going to go out of order here on the questions. So the first question is, how do you envision the future of CMSs? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, is that the #1 question?
No, we're saving the #1 question
All right.
for the end. It's going to be the best for last. In fact,
right.
I'm going to create a poll right now to address that #1 question. So why don't you go ahead and answer the CMS question first?
All right, sounds good. I mean, this is a big question, and I can talk out for hours about this. But let me give a few thoughts here. I think in the short term, future, I guess, I'm pretty interested in sort of the decoupled architecture where the front end of the CMS is decoupled, and where you basically have the CMS become more of a backend that communicates over RESTful web services with a client-side JavaScript framework. I think we'll see more and more CMSs evolve into that direction because, because with more and more different devices that need to display content, I think that makes sense to do. Longer term, I think it's where big trends like machine learning and the Internet of Things come into play. And I think, CMSs have to evolve into a more of an experience management system. It's not just enough to create content or to manage content, which is the traditional role of the CMS, but CMSs need to think about how they can create user experiences across all of these different channels, whether it's a browser, whether it's a native app, whether it's an in-store display, whether it's an Apple Watch, which, by the way, doesn't even have a browser. Right? And so with all of these different devices, how do you create a continuous experience across these things? I also believe that in the future, the world will be more push-based and less pull-based, meaning in the old world, you would go to different websites to find the information that you want. But in the future, more and more information or services, doesn't have to be just content, will find you. And Google now is an example of that kind of service. But to do that, CMSs need to really understand what content they have, and they also need to understand users and have a user profile and maybe understand their interests. And if you have content with a lot of metadata, and if you have users with metadata, you can do better matchmaking. And I think that kind of matchmaking is something that CMSs will have to do more and more. So from becoming more push-based and less pull-based to working better with all of these different channels and devices, I think that's where the future is at, which is terribly exciting in my opinion, because it means the role of a CMS will be expanded.
Great, and we'll take one more technical question here. So having only worked with WordPress in the past, how large of a learning curve would it be to experiment with Drupal, coming from that WordPress background? Would having experience with WordPress ease the learning curve at all? What benefits may Drupal bring to the table that WordPress lacks? I guess you kind of already answered that last part, but maybe you could talk about the transition. How tough is it to kind of wrap your head around Drupal?
Yeah, it's going to be more difficult to learn Drupal than it is to learn WordPress, because it's a more complex system, and it's more complex because it's doing more things. So I don't know. It depends, I guess. If WordPress was your first introduction to programming, because a lot of people learn to program through WordPress, and a lot of people learn to program through Drupal as well. But if WordPress was how you learn to program, I think it could be pretty steep learning curve, because Drupal now uses object-oriented programming. WordPress, I believe, is still primarily procedural programming. But if you are a professionally trained developer, you understand design patterns and these kinds of things, then I think Drupal could be actually fairly easy to learn. Whether you come from WordPress or not, I guess doesn't really matter for those people, or matters less maybe for those people. So I guess it depends. Either way, I do think it would be great to learn Drupal, because I think it's a very powerful system, and also learning some of these design patterns, I think, will make you a better developer, quite frankly. So I think even though the learning curve can be steep, it's not a bad career choice to learn more than one system and to get exposure to, to Drupal.
Okay, great, thanks. So we have that final question, which is the most upvoted of all of them by a landslide. 436 votes for this question. So I think, Dries, I got to give you some context for this question here. So I think our audience might be a little bit hungry right now. I don't think they may have eaten lunch yet.
Okay.
That may explain this question. I'm not quite sure. But we've noticed that in the background,
all right,
there's this refrigerator.
Oh.
Right?
Yes.
Our audience wants to know what's in the fridge. That is the #1 question with 444 votes. And we've actually polled our audience so that we're actually surveying them for them to guess what's in the fridge.
All right.
We'll see if they're actually right. So are you willing to share with us what's in the fridge?
Sure. Well,
you want to go back there and open it up?
Yeah. Let me tell you a story about the fridge first, if that's okay.
Oh, there's a story. Okay.
Yeah. This is actually a very, very old fridge. It used to be, it's not a functional fridge. So I don't know if that eliminates some of the poll results. But this fridge used to belong to my grandparents. And it's at least 40 years old. And so it was in their kitchen. And I always liked the fridge because it was, you can't tell maybe, but it's like round. And at some point they remodeled their kitchen, and I asked them, hey, can I have that fridge? Because I think it's really cool. It's kind of like, almost like a piece of art, if you will, and so they gave it to me, but I don't use it as a fridge, but I use it as a, to put stuff in. And so it has photos and books in there, and I can show you. There's a bunch of photos. There is, lots of notebooks in here. So basically, a lot of junk papers. I think my sorry, I dropped some of the photos. Some of my tax documents are in there. I probably could use somebody to come help clean it out.
That's awesome. Wow. So, all right, let's go back to the audience poll to see what the audience thought. So the #1 choice, 53% of our audience thought that there was beer in the fridge. So I think our audience wants to get drunk right now. That is my guess here. I don't know. They're thinking about beer for some reason. The #2 answer is nothing. They thought it was empty, like it was a fake fridge or something, which is actually pretty close to the result, right?
Right.
There was no food or beverage.
No,
food came in.
I have a separate fridge for beer, so
that
helps the audience.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. All right, so Dries has graciously made himself available for the audience to ask questions. Is that true, Dries? You can
that is true.
Hang
Yeah.
out here for a while.
Yeah.
So audience, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to paste the Google Hangouts link for you guys to join Dries. It's first come, first serve. We'll try to get as many people accommodated as possible. And Dries, I really want to thank you. You know, it's really inspiring listening to you and your story for Drupal. Acquia is a huge success. You know, great company that I look up to. So thanks for making a difference in all of our lives. And guys, if you enjoyed Dries's talk today, please consider making a donation to a nonprofit. You can click the button there to do that, and check out Hack Guides. We'd love your contribution to this open source project that we're launching today at the Hack Summit. So thanks again, Dries. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for having me.